Hey, it's Drybear. And I'm a little late here, but I wanted to finally give my opinion on Path of Exile 2 since the .3 launch. It's been about a month since the new season has launched with the Abyss League, and I want to take this from a global perspective and just talk about the state of Path of Exile 2 right now. Because a lot has changed in .1, .2, and now with .3. A lot has been improving, but there's still a lot that needs to be discussed and looked at through the conversation here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to first talk about the league specifically. I have a lot of really good things to say about Abyss League, and some negatives that I think can just be a learning lesson going forward, and also just things that I think should be looked at for the long term. If we are looking towards a 1.0 release for Path of Exile 2, then I think these are the things that they need to address or at least think about as they're moving into new patches. And of course, I'll have timestamps down below if you want to skip around for whatever topics you're interested in, and the hope with this is, since the last time, we had .2, they released Huntress, we had some new, like a little baby mini league coming out with the spirits and everything, so it wasn't like the most major thing in the world, and they took a different approach this time around with .3 in that they focused on the major issues that were plaguing the community. Rather than trying to launch a new class and look at those major elements, they tried to create a league mechanic that is interesting and test builds, but also look at the core fundamentals of the game themselves. And specifically, they also did a kind of really fun exercise in that they sat down after .2 and said, what are the things that are plaguing the players and what are our big primary key metrics that we want to hit with this next patch. They put it all up on a whiteboard and focused on it, and I would say most of the things that they wrote down were actually successfully handled.
Yeah, I remember early on we had the process. Actually, we just literally grabbed my whiteboard in my office and we just wrote down every single problem.
Yeah.
And I'd say it's not a strategy we've done to this degree, this methodically before.
Right.
We were like, okay, we have to solve everything on this whiteboard.
Yep. Literally made a tier list up there, like this is T1, this is T2.
We did actually fully of every problem, and there were things in there like performance and things that aren't necessarily the actual game content.
I mean, the very one at the top of the list was campaign is a slog, right? Like that was the one that we were like, we've got to solve that. Things like that were just like because we're really trying to be honest about like here are the real issues.
And the reason it ends up being a bit nerve-wracking is because we had a goal to fix all of it. And we didn't get to fix. We aren't fixing literally everything. We're fixing almost, a lot. And I'm sure a few new problems introduced here and there.
So we're gonna kind of look at that from like a whiteboard list. If I could be so brazen as to try and make my own whiteboard list of things that I would like to see in .4, .5, .6, and beyond, that's what we're gonna look at today. Let's start with the Abyss League. I actually have been enjoying the Abyss League quite a lot. It got some facelifts from Path of Exile 1. It also got some just new aesthetics and some new vibes to it and mechanics that I think were really nicely improved from the first iteration of this kind of concept. I think they did a good job of making it feel like it is part of the league. As you go through, you will find Abyss tears all over the place. I also feel like they are a really big forcing factor in the game overall. Every time, whether I'm in a big juiced map or even during the campaign, if I saw those little tears in the ground and the green coming up, I actually was genuinely afraid, even in like endgame mapping, because some of the things that you run into in the Abyss are very threatening, and it does feel like it's kind of like this existential threat onto Wraeclast in general when you run into these abysses in general. I think the Abyss crafting got a lot better, and I think some of the deterministic aspects you have to the omens and the essences in League are great, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The only downside, the only gripe that I have with Abyss in general is I think that the rares and the affixes that came with the Abyss League are probably the weakest part of it overall. I actually like every aspect of Abyss, including desecration and going into like the well and everything. All of that is really, really cool. I just think a lot of the affixes for the rares in the Abyss League are really obtuse and just over the line of what I would consider enjoyable. I think a lot of fixed animations where the enemies are locked in immunity and you can't attack them until they do this in animation, or they disappear and they hide underground for long periods of time, or they have like these really unexplained, like even just looking at the Amumu's, whatever, like all these different affixes, they're named for flavor text. They don't explain what they do. They're very confusing. And even then, I would say that they're not equal in how they impact some builds versus others. I actually think that the only downside really of the Abyss League is just how bad the rares are, the affixes they come with, and some of the things that they do in general. It felt like they really just wanted the rares to feel objectively way harder than anything else that you experience at that play level, whatever you're at. And I think that that ended up making the rares feel kind of awkward and mostly just annoying in a lot of ways, where you have to jump inside their cloud to try and deal damage to them. You try to wait for them to finish their freaking animation so they stop being immune to all damage and sources, even though they're walking around. The random teleporting of the mobs that'll just blink on top of you and explode. The affixes on the ground with the little bubbles that pop, the crystals that pop, like everything. It just feels like a lot of times it feels unfair the way that you end up getting challenged, or in some cases die to the Abyss rares. But everything else about Abyss is amazing. I love the items that dropped. I love the cool little like ascendancy you get with the Lich. I love jumping into the well. I even like the boss itself. Even before the nerf, I didn't really have any issues with the boss in the Abyss in general. So I think overall it's a great league. And I actually hope that it stays around as a permanent addition. I don't know if they've actually mentioned that or not, but I think it is a great addition to the game. Overall, really, really cool. And the aesthetic is also really strong, though there are some clarity issues with it. I think Abyss League is probably, you know, one of the better concepts that has come into Path of Exile 2. And I'm glad they, you know, went through and made some additions to Abyss League, coming from PoE 1 to PoE 2, and kind of some of the cleanups they put into it as well. So realistically, the only thing I would change about Abyss League is I think that the affixes that come with the rares in Abyss League need to be renamed or better explained, or at least have some kind of reference for them. A lot of times it's just a random proper noun that you don't know what it means, you don't know how to counter it, you don't know how it works, and a lot of times it's very poorly explained and described, and they're also just very, 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 very strong. Like a lot of times, you know, preventing regeneration, then draining your HP and dealing ticket damage to you at the same time, while having forced, like, locked immunity phases and things like that, to me just feels really bad. You can overcome it once your build's good to go and you have everything set up, or if you have a really strong build, depending on what you're going for in the meta, you can beat it. But I think that honestly, with how much experience GGG has in making these concepts and making these affixes, I think they could have done way better in making it enjoyable but also challenging at the same time. Next up, I want to talk about a very important topic that I think is worth mentioning, at least early on in the video, and that is the concept of gameplay clarity. Now, here is a very storied challenge and interaction between developers on projects like these, right? So in the old days when we were making games, most of the focus on games, because technology was limited, was on making the games legible, meaning like the gameplay clarity is really high, the affordance of some of the design systems are very clear. If you go back and play old games like Mega Man or things like that, everything that's happening on screen is very clear and defined for the player, easy to pick up and understand. Everything that happens from boss mechanics, climbing things, like everything is really, really well described. And I think that as we got better in time, graphics got better, engines got better, all of that got better. There's always been this dichotomy, especially on high fidelity games like Path of Exile 2, where gameplay clarity and artistry butt heads really hard, where like the more photorealistic or realistic a game gets in general, the more challenge and pressure it puts on gameplay clarity. And I think that this is probably the lowest point Path of Exile 2 has ever been. And I also feel like, at least with the Abyss League, the gameplay clarity is should be put on like a very important watch list, because we're at the edge of it becoming almost untenable. Like even now, a lot of situations, whether you're going for like a mortar build with like tactician or something, or with warrior, the gameplay clarity goes into the toilet. It's actually really, really bad. And so some of that is just, you know, with the designs of the mechanics you're facing, or with the VFX and you know, the lighting systems in the area as well. A lot of those can make a big impact. But I also think that there needs to be a lot more done to make the game a lot more readable and understandable. Oftentimes you get hit, you don't know what killed you. You can't even see the things that are on the ground when there are effects all over the place. Sometimes you're on a bright map. I ended up, you know, I started with a fire sorceress with infusions, and I ended up working my way to cold, and you can see I ended up with a frostbolt build once I finally started messing around doing Path of Building. But on the bright, like daytime maps, when the sun's going through all my ice, all I see is white everywhere. I can't see a dang thing. There's explosions all over the ground, which generally, if this was just like a hack and slash, nothing matters kind of game, that kind of clarity wouldn't really be a big problem. However, in Path of Exile 2, it is a huge problem, because there will be tons of after death effects, explosion effects, projectiles, special animations, unblockable attacks from bosses and rares and things like that, or you know, exiles, you know, the rogue exiles that you run into, things that you really need to have high clarity on, because if you don't dodge them properly, they will one-shot your character regardless of your build. I mean, there are some things in the game that even if you have 12,000 energy shield, if you get hit by it, you will still get one shot. And the downside with that is it's on the player to recognize it and dodge it ahead of time, but the clarity has gotten so bad in Path of Exile 2 that it's becoming a big problem. Now, I have a ton of experience in doing this. Obviously, as someone, you know, who has worked in game development, working with artists and game designers, doing game design myself, it's a never-ending battle, right? Artists want it to be as pretty as it can be because that's their job. Game designers want it to be as clean as it can be because it's their job, and you don't want either side to win, right? When only game designers win, you get like a minesweeper, right? Like it's just very functional but not very pretty. And if only the artists win, then at the end of the day it's super pretty, but you can't see a dang thing, you can't understand a dang thing, there's no clarity, the gameplay elements start to suffer really bad. And so the ideal is to find that middle ground where you're in between the two. It's very pretty looking, but the fidelity of the game doesn't encroach upon the clarity of gameplay that you really need, especially when there are things that are threatening your life to kill you in one shot. You need to be able to frickin' see them. So my hope is, since we're kind of on that threshold, like we're sitting right now with .3, we're sitting on the fence where we're like just leaning over into the game becoming a muddled mess where you can't see anything and random things will hit you out of nowhere, and your only solution is just to have so much defense that the things that you can't see are hitting you and not one-shotting you. That's really your only solution most of the time, because you just can't see most of the time. So I hope that they take this as a very serious issue that needs to be improved, because if we keep having patches like .3 where all the abyss effects come online, new abilities, we have all these new lineage supports that make crazy effects going on, and these really cool things, the clarity is going to keep getting worse and worse over time, and it needs to be a pretty critical issue that they need to find some way to solve that problem. Now, I think there's multiple ways to do this. The most like laid back approach is to go through all of the VFX systems and all of the ground systems and the lighting and the way characters animate and things like that, and try to make them work well together. But the problem is it's not really like a scalable approach, right? Because as you're adding 100 new mobs and 50 new bosses with patches like they've been doing, it becomes almost impossible to like laser focus, hit it on the head, and make the things read really well in gameplay. They could also go down the road of trying to use UI overlays or like non-artistry level expressions that help you understand what's going on. They do this already with sound cues on unblockables, but there's also effects on the ground that you really need to be able to see that will one-shot you, that have almost no impact or visual representation. They have no sound effects that will rise above the mix and be very obvious to you. So either they need to add some UI elements of like, hey, there's something on the ground nearby that can kill you, or they just need to just do like a full top to bottom refresh on how the game looks and how well you can read the things that are going on. Because again, as this game gets more and more complex, we add more weapons, we add more mobs, we add more bosses, we add more lineage supports that do crazy things. You're going to get to the point where you can't see anything, and it's just up to you to just be afraid all the time and roll and run away like there's a ghost chasing you, because there might be some glob on the ground you can't see, or some pit that you're standing in that you don't actually see because there's delirium fog all over on top of it, or you're running the new tactician mortar build where everything's on fire and you can't see anything on the screen. I think it's only going to get worse from here if they don't sit down and take a very serious look on how they can improve the clarity of the game overall. Next up, I want to dive into a, this is again in the mind of trying to put things on the whiteboard that will make the game better over time. I want to get into what I would consider like fundamental flaws of the game themselves, or things that, they had a really great idea, but the execution didn't hit the mark they were looking for, and how to improve it. So we're going to just look at kind of like game-wide, high-level issues that are still plaguing the game right now that I think should be on their whiteboard for .4 or .5 that would make a really big impact on not only getting new players into the game, but also helping people stay for longer. Because I think there is definitely some challenges with the Endgame, obviously, or people getting partway through a league and then just abandoning and going to other games. And I think that some of these issues can be addressed that are a little bit more fundamental, like baseline foundation, that can make the game a lot better if you were to change these single items. Now, a disclaimer on this, we're going to talk about some baseline level aspects of the game, but realistically, you know, there's going to be some concepts that you have to understand as we go through this that are really important to understanding what kind of game Path of Exile 2 is. The first thing is that it is an ARPG. It is a loot-based, grind-based game that has a very wide and deep set of systems that all interact with each other, and those are part of the experience, right? So we're not talking about, in general, like a true Souls-like game that is like one character with a weapon versus one boss. We are talking about a heavily itemized game with a lot of customization and things that you can put into it, and so there are a lot of leeway that you can apply to the developers. Like, for example, there's a mechanic that feels very unfair to the player, but the player can overcome that mechanic by building their character in response to it, right? Like, you know, yes, there are some elemental explosions that are really unfair and unfun, but by getting maximum resists or knowing that they're there or playing around them, you can build your character, you can modify your overall, you know, meshing of abilities to counter these mechanics. And because the game is very heavily itemized, it allows them to get away with some of these mechanics that in general would not fly in a roguelike or a dungeon crawler or an RPG, because you have so much control over how you build your character to overcome these challenges. Now, from that standpoint, let's go into probably one of the most talked about aspects right now, which is going to be game balance. It's going to be like the level of variety that we have in builds. You know, I would say in .1 and .2, there was a good maybe 60 to 70% of the game that was really hard to make good builds from. Like, there was a core subset of like 30% of the skills and support gems that were really the only ones you could run if you were serious about the game and wanted to clear difficult content. And then 70% of the game was absolutely worthless. You couldn't build it. And I think that has gotten much better, but it still has a lot of flaws, right? The lineage supports and the lifting of the support restrictions on support gems in .3 made that infinitely better. I think that those changes were amazing. I love the lineage supports. They've opened up a lot of opportunities for really fun builds. I'm even using one right now. You can see doing like the wild shard spread on my frostbolts. Super fun, very enjoyable. And I think by lifting the support gems, it's made a really big difference. So that 70% of the game that was useless before has gone down to maybe 50 to 40% of the game that's useless. There's a lot more that can be played right now. And I think they really need to focus on trying to improve the balance of those, because it creates a really awkward situation for new players coming into the game. And what I mean by that is, if 40% of the game, like skill gems, builds, and play styles, are all useless, then that means that if a new player joins the game and tries to play, they might have a chance of picking one of those useless skills or useless builds, which ends up putting you in a situation where they feel weak all the time, they feel like they can't complete the content, that the game is unnecessarily difficult and forces them into really hard choices, and they end up quitting because of it. I actually did an experiment this time around with the campaign. I picked Fireball as the build because I wanted to see if we could run Fire Sorceress. I know there's obviously some Black Flame builds for like Blood Mage right now where you could run, but currently right now there isn't really any major way that you can run Fire on a Sorceress, just because it just feels really weak. And so what I did is I tried to run the experience of not trying to pick what I knew was good or lean on mechanics that I knew could work as a player who's played Path of Exile 2 would normally do, but rather I just wanted to be bullheaded, which I imagine most new players are. Like, I start a Sorceress, I think fireballs are cool, I want to shoot the Konosuba destruction ball across the screen, and that's what I want to do. And I forced myself to only stick to Fireball throughout the campaign, and I can tell you that for the most part, I had a horrible time. The bosses took forever to kill, the mechanics lasted really, really long periods of time, and even with, you know, like maxing out really good gear or crafting or, you know, using trade, oftentimes if you're using one of the skills that isn't good enough, you're just going to have a bad time the whole way through. And I think that they need to keep trying to focus on making those builds better and making it so that at the very least, I think their end goal should be that you can pick pretty much any major ability throughout the campaign and be able to complete the campaign with it. It's a bit of a pipe dream. I think they'll probably realistically only get to like 80 to 90% of the game is viable for the campaign. Obviously, some things are supportive abilities that you wouldn't be able to pick as your main when you're doing it. But I do think it's very important that when you're offering these skill gems to new players that are coming in trying to play Path of Exile 2 for the first time, they're going to get stuck on some of these builds that are absolutely garbage. And there's not really anything they can do besides re-rolling to a different build or a different ascendancy or a different playstyle. And that is going to be a big contributing factor to players leaving the game when new patches come in or new players trying the game for the first time. Now, I also want to talk about something that I think could probably be debatable depending on your perspective. There is currently in the game right now, I think there are several design systems and design decisions that are forcing players to play faster builds with better clear, right? Let's dive into the concept that everyone's playing Deadeye this season. Everyone was playing Lightning Spear Amazon last season. Everyone's playing this, that sort of thing. There's obviously going to be a level of meta chasing that goes on. It's human nature. You can't avoid it. Every game that has any amount of comparison between elements is always going to have this problem. But I think there are core fundamental decisions in the game that are forcing players to go towards the faster play styles that play at range, that if you were to alleviate or just outright change these mechanics, it would open the opportunity for especially slower builds during campaign, but slower builds in general. The first one is going to be something that I really hope that they either backtrack on or just remove or change in a major way. And that is currently the way that the game has at a game level. This is not part of your skill tree. This is not some affix or modifier. It's not part of a skill or anything like that. This is a baseline decision on the game overall. And that is the light stunning or the mini stunning that happens with the gameplay as it stands. Across the board, across all of Path of Exile 2, any source of damage, depending on your stun threshold, can cause your character to stutter step or stand in place with a light stun. And I think that this is a problem for the game that needs to be addressed and changed. The main thing is that obviously you can counter it with, stun threshold. You can actually build around it. But I think that because any source of damage can cause your character to stutter step and interrupt what they're doing, it is, in essence, forcing players to choose faster builds or to overcompensate for this aspect with the decisions that they make with their build in general. I think since they have an affix system, they can put stunning, which is already in the game, as part of a modifier, or make it so that small enemies and medium-sized enemies don't have this light stun built into them, and that heavier enemies, like I'm not expecting the guys that have the giant wheel that walk around and they slam it down, or the big T-Rex looking guys that march around, or any large enemy that carries a lot of weight. I think that's perfectly fine for those to have built-in light stunning, because obviously if you do get hit by those slow things, that makes sense. But I think there's a big problem when a lot of endgame builds don't run stun threshold because you need other stats that are very useful. Oftentimes, if a little boulder ant can walk up and light stun your character and cause it to stutter step and like recoil because it got hit by a small amount of damage, depending on your stun threshold, I think that creates a situation where it encourages people to have faster animations, higher skill speed, higher attack speed and cast speed, and also go for abilities that will attack from a range. So if you're running like the Smith-the-Katava Slam or big windups or even snipe with rangers, those things end up getting by default discouraged because when you start the animation, any amount of damage or any source of damage, an archer from across the screen, depending on your stun threshold, can cause you to interrupt that ability by default. Like it's just a game level decision that interrupts that. I think that discourages people from running long cast animation or long animation skills overall. It also discourages people from being slower in general because those things can happen more often. And it also can be a big strain on the defense types that you have in the game as well. Things like energy shield being a lot more effective versus, evasion and even the armor setups. Obviously, you can get to a point where at endgame, you stop thinking about this sort of thing. It can still really kill you in a lot of situations. But in my opinion, dying to a light stun, especially from a normal enemy, feels like a really cheap way to kill the player. It doesn't feel like it has a really good dichotomy of the reason I died is because it's my fault versus the game's fault. This is something that you'll talk about in game design in general, is the idea of like it being the game's fault versus your fault. And I think in general, it should always strive to be the player's fault. A good example of this is the curse mechanics you get in the endgame mapping. So like in Feeble, Elemental Weakness, Temporal Chains, a lot of times rather than just applying it to your character, which would be not a great interaction, you can see that I even dodged the Enfeeble that was on the ground. It's instead, it appears, has a warning with a delay, and then if you get hit by it, it's very much your fault as the player for getting hit by it, right? It's not a game level thing. You could have gotten out of the way, and so you could have done something to make it better, and I think that is a really good interaction between the player and the mechanic they're facing, whereas I feel like the light stunning in a lot of ways, especially if you're a slower character who moves slower, getting hit by those kinds of things feels really, really bad, where you start to wind up and you get light stunned, and you start to wind up and you get light stunned, and you're constantly being interrupted. And so the faster you can be, the higher your skill speed can be, the less likely you are to get interrupted when you're doing your animation, which means that by default, it's encouraging players to play faster builds because you get actively punished for playing something slower. Additionally, I think this global light stunning mechanic is a problem because a lot of things in the game are not a single source of damage, right? So if you have an enemy that shoots a volley, right, the little scuttle crabs that have the darts, or little spitting spiders or whatever it is, there's plenty of mobs that shoot volleys or multiple explosions in a row. There are essence effects like the yellow ones that land on the ground and shoot up in multiple waves. If you have things that hit multiple times, but the first hit causes a light stun, it all but guarantees several more hits afterwards, which can cause really big problems. Additionally, it can also cause problems where there's something on the ground that's about to explode and you try to get out of the way, but then an archer from downwind shoots one arrow that does a minor amount of damage to you, but then that causes you to light stun. The mini stutter that you had on your character causes you to stand in the AoE. You get blown up in a one shot and now you're dead and you lose experience. You have to, roll over and do a new map or reset your trial, things like that. I think that they have shown that they can very easily make healthy ecosystems that make the game hard without being cheap, making every source of damage in the game cause a light stun. Because I think that is directly countering their goal of making a Souls-like, more discrete, determinate gameplay combat experience in the game. And by default, this kind of thing is encouraging people to play faster builds because then they don't get interrupted as much and they can clear things from a safer distance. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there aren't ways around this. Obviously, you can run a high armor build with high stun threshold on like a mercenary or a monk or a warrior, and you can very easily avoid these kinds of things. And honestly, when you get to endgame and you have a really strong build that's clearing screens, the mini stuns become a lot less of a problem, more of an inconvenience. But I do think that especially during the campaign and early mapping, this kind of concept is causing big problems and furthering the disparity between the Deadeyes and the warriors that are playing through the game overall. So I wanted to put it out there as something to consider, as I think that they could very easily, lessen or remove the game-wide light stunning that happens and put that on affixes, modifiers, or specifically put it on large enemies where it makes sense that you would stagger backward, right? Like if a little boulder ant comes up and licks my ankle and I clutch my pearls and recoil in shock every time that happens, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. But obviously if a guy the size of a freaking Mack truck comes and drops a refrigerator on my head when he does an attack, I would imagine that my body would react to that. The physics involved in that is pretty horrendous, so I would imagine that would hurt. So I think having game-wide affixes, that apply these mini stuns and light stuns would make the game better overall. And if I could be so bold as to call out one thing that I think would be a better example of, maybe just not having a good interaction of the player versus the attacker, is going to be these guys right here, these Eternal Knights. Now again, it is an itemization game. You can build around this. There is gameplay against the Eternal Knights that you can do, but I think that if you're a high level of projectile, high amount of projectile build, and you hit one of these Eternal Knights from around the corner, like you're playing a Spark build, or you're playing a Rapid Fire build, or any kind of like Ranger build in general, or Sorceress build, like the Frostbolt build, these guys, when they take any amount of damage from distance or from a certain angle, they will fire off heat-seeking projectiles that deal damage to you. And personally, for me, I think they're one of the few mobs in the game that doesn't really have a very fair or fun interaction between the player otherwise. You obviously can go behind them and attack them. There's other affixes that can make a big difference as well. Like obviously if they have proximal tangibility or they have, the bubble that slows you, those things can get really awkward. But I think that the fact that they take any amount of damage and they shoot projectiles that do high damage to you, and they also heat seek as well. Like, they're not just a straight shot, they will curve and try to go towards your character. Oftentimes, if you're playing a high projectile count build and they're off screen, or they spawn as a rare from a mechanic like Abyss or a Strongbox or something, there's already a bunch of projectiles up in the air, and then you're going to hit them unknowingly, and then all of a sudden a whole bunch of murderous projectiles are going to fly right at your character and kill you really fast. So I think they need to look at mechanics like these and enemy types like these and try to make them a little bit more fair for what they do and what they accomplish, while making sure they have some counterplay that is fun. There aren't that many mobs that I think that are really, really bad on this front. I think the Eternal Knights are probably the best example of those just being a little bit too unequitable for what they accomplish against the player and what build you're running. Next up, I want to talk about knowledge. And this is something that I think is a big part of Path of Exile too, right? Like, if you have you converted into the Exile cult, and, you know, all of Path of Exile, the fun of Path of Exile is learning what you can and can't do, learning how to make your build better, making a build that sucks, and then improving it over time, and also just dying and learning your lessons as you go along. I think that's a big part of it. However, I think that one thing that they can improve upon, especially against competitors like Last Epoch, which looks at making clarity and knowledge and Codex a lot easier, I think that as they move towards a 1.0 release, they need to do a really big effort towards making information available to the player as easily and as upfront as possible going forward. A good example of this is being able to look up affixes that are on enemies. This would have helped a lot in the Abyss League, I'm sure, for a lot of people, right? A lot of the Abyss League affixes that you get on the Abyss League rares, you often have to look it up or just run into them over and over and over and wonder, why is this Abyss rare immune to damage for long periods of time? Oh, I have to wait until they do this stupid little tail slap animation or they come back out of the ground. Why is this mob taking no damage? Oh, I have to get into the little black cloud and attack them. What is this multi-ring green thing that just has some proper noun name that names some lich from history inside of Wraeclast, but it doesn't explain what the affix does, how to counter it, or what's going on? And I think that kind of obtuse level of just abstractness can be improved upon by adding a codex into the game. Obviously, this is something that would be like more of like a tutorial aspect to the game in general, and something that you want to look at as you move towards release. But I think it's actually super important to be able to manage what's going on, right? So like, if we go here and we go to gems, one of the things that I wish you could see is like, look up which gems are there without bringing up an uncut gem. Like, you can't actually look at a list of the skills, as far as I know, without bringing up an uncut gem, and I think you should be able to look through those in general. Same thing for like essences, like being able to view the ones you don't own. Same thing for socketables in general, and especially making it a lot clearer and more accessible for players to be able to see what are suffixes, what are affixes, what's available on an item. There are third-party tools that make this available online you can go and look up, but I think for players that are just getting into the game or are intermediate players, it would be really, really good to be able to show, at least in a viewable sense from a codex, what suffixes and affixes can appear on an item, and that will help people understand how to craft as well. Because I think a big part of being able to craft is understanding, you know, what can spawn on a suffix, what can spawn on an affix, how to use the items that you have or need to be able to unlock things as part of the game as well. So I think a lot of that comes into being able to have a codex that's referenceable. Additionally, when you're looking at some things on top of these as well, you can hold Alt to view things. I don't know what the console command is, or a keybind is for that, but this doesn't always work and is kind of shoddy as well. So I'd love it to be able to reference everything that gets affected by the choices that you're making in game. Maybe not even just on the skill tree, but also on the Atlas tree that you could look at as well. I think this is something that other ARPGs do really well. Like, they'll actually have a visual representation of how many suffixes something can have, how many affixes, you know, suffixes and prefixes something can have, and compare those together so you can actually see and look at them. And I think that would be, I feel like that's something that's unnecessarily obtuse right now, that you have to jump around on websites and learn for the first time and play around with, that they could very easily make available in game, something referenceable, so you can see, oh, that's how that works, and you can look through it and see it. Another thing that I would love to see them improve as well is to improve the character sheet. Right now, there is a large amount of stats that you can't find anywhere. Like, whatever it is, you can't see it on your character sheet, you can't see it on your abilities. Like, when you're looking for these abilities and try to find them, some of these things just really don't show up anywhere referenceable, and so you just have to kind of guess on how big they are, what they're doing, what contribution they have. Obviously, we have these like hold on like pop-ups that you can look at, but they don't show up on everything, and they don't have some stats showing on this. So I think they should really expand the character sheet to show like the total number of stats that you have, kind of like Path of Building or some building websites online. They could just really show like where those things are so that you can understand exactly what's going on and you can reference it and improve upon it as you go. Next, let's talk about crafting and trading. I'm just going to put those two together in one category. I think that this is probably, no, it definitely is. This is the best state that Path of Exile 2 has been in for crafting and trading alike. And I think that there are some lessons that can be learned from this as well. The crafting has got significantly better. I've been able to craft and hold on to some of the most powerful items I have ever had in Path of Exile 2, outside of just farming a bunch, getting 500 divs, and buying a really ridiculous item if you're in Trade League. But obviously for like SSF and things like that, I think the crafting has gotten significantly better, and it's actually super fun. And one thing that I loved about Path of Exile 1 is even when a white item drops on the ground, you're excited because you know the potential for what you can create using the crafting system in PoE 1. That was never really the case in PoE 2 up until .3, and now it absolutely is. There are some very powerful deterministic items that you can craft if you have the orbs and crafting items, omens and things like that, and essences to create really, really strong items, and it's super fun. I think Desecrating is really cool. Sanctified is awesome. Corrupted is still really fun and stressful and fun and stressful at the same time to build all those together. I think that coming together has been really good. And I think that, you know, with the higher quality orbs making a big difference as you progress through the game and unlock greater or perfect orbs, along with the omens and the different essences that you can get. I've even just like updated my Atlas tree from previous seasons to include a lot more essence gains on the Atlas tree that help you just get better essences because they're awesome. And the crafting in general is really exciting and cool. I hope Desecration stays going forward into the future because it allows you to create some really fun items with new combinations of stats. This is fun. And I think that the changes they made for Trade League this season, super fun. Like the passive level of being able to set up a shop and go do things without having to interact with other players, and you're just spending more time playing and less time teleporting in and out of your maps and doing things like that, the better. I think that the trade system has been a massive success. And you think about it, like there's two different things too, right? Like, so for before, when we were playing Path of Exile, we didn't have the currency exchange. That's relatively new. They put it out in Path of Exile 1 over the last year and a half and then ported it to Path of Exile 2. And then the passive shop as well. These two things together has made Path of Exile, in my opinion, way better of an experience at all levels of play as soon as you unlock trade and if you stay with Trade League, that sort of thing. But I think these things are things that they've been stubborn on in the past, right? Having the very obtuse, asynchronous, really awkward, forced meetup kind of Facebook marketplace way of trading before, and they stuck with that for like nearly a decade, like a really long time of just this really ancient, archaic system. And even just not having the currency exchange as well, where you have to trust other people to put up bulk items of currencies, especially with all the currencies that you have now. I end up liquidating a lot of things as I go through the game and try to selling things off. Currency exchange plus the new shop has been awesome. And I think it's also a good lesson on some of the things that they've been exceedingly stubborn on, trying to not, you know, they don't want to break the game or ruin the economy or the relationship the player has with the items that they get and how powerful they get. But I think that these two things are things that they were hesitant to do in the past, that now that they've finally done it, it is just literally an all-around win for everyone playing the game. That I think that they should kind of learn from that and look to do more of these things, like caving on things they're being exceedingly stubborn on that could just make the game better overall. Lastly, I just want to put in my 2 cents on the campaign situation as it stands right now. This is also another major topic of discussion in the game. There are a lot of people that want like the adventure mode or the skip mode that we have in Diablo 4 or the short campaign that we have in Last Epoch, yada yada. And I think there's definitely been this back and forth with the developers and the leadership at GGG that want to have a really good campaign that's long and enjoyable. And this is going to be something that's going to be discussed, I think, until the end of time when it comes to Path of Exile 2. Obviously, the devs have a vision for what they're looking for. And in general, I think that the campaign got longer, but it's still super fun. And I think that if they can manage to actually improve the balance and the overall like variety of builds that can clear the campaign, I think that people are going to be a lot more accepting of having a longer campaign. The campaign definitely got a lot longer than it was before. I would say that even with doing cruel mode, the new modes are pretty fast, but also a lot more challenging. There's another idea that one thing I'm not sure on, and let me know where your head is at on this one in the comments down below, but I was actually pretty surprised that when we went into Act 4 and the interlude acts, they started using a large amount of chaos damage from enemies. So like bleed attacks or poison attacks. And I think this is actually a big challenge point. If you're a veteran player and you know to get chaos resistance or you're really good at dodging, it's not a major thing. However, I feel that chaos resistance, like I don't think there should be that much chaos damage in the campaign, mainly because the rolling or getting chaos resistance on your items or even getting the socketables that provide chaos resistance, in my opinion, is more of an end game thing. It's actually not that easy to get chaos resistance reliably on the items that you have during campaign. And I think that, like the Act 4 mobs, like there are entire zones in Act 4 that are entirely chaos damage, and they will obliterate your character if you have 0% chaos resistance or not enough defenses. And I feel like it's kind of jarring for the campaign to have a large amount of chaos resistance in it. Obviously, you want players to be aware of it, and it's not like you want them to be completely like oblivious to the fact that chaos damage exists, and then they go into endgame mapping and then they get one shot that way. But it does feel like it's kind of like a really big jump where it feels like the campaign is kind of encroaching a little bit on the endgame experience, where you're just kind of jumping into the campaign. You get to Act 4, the interludes, and you start getting blown up when you weren't before, and you're not really sure why. And introducing those damage types so early can feel really awkward. And I do believe vehemently that the disparity between people saying the campaign is perfectly fine versus I hate the campaign, it's too long and too hard, does come down to the balance issues they have in the early onset of some skills. Like, for example, again, I forced myself to run Fireball and Sorceress with infusions during the campaign, and I had an awful time doing it. It was probably the worst experience I've had clearing a campaign in Path of Exile history, just because it was just so weak compared to other things. Now, I really don't want to run into the situation where the only answer for some players that are running some builds in the campaign is just to quit and re-roll, or to change their build entirely because the thing that they enjoy is not good enough to clear the campaign. But I would like to see them improve upon that over time. And lastly, a quick note on the end game, another growing topic that has been talked about a lot for Path of Exile 2. They do plan on releasing a new update soon that will make some pretty major changes to endgame. I'm kind of curious to see how that's going to feel once it's all said and done. The major changes there are they're making some changes to the patches on the ground, which I think is awesome. I do not like ice patches all over the floor. They're very intense, very numerous, and they're also not very mindful of the kind of map you're on, because very large open maps will oftentimes have the same amount of patches that very tight corridor smaller maps will have. And if you're lucky enough to get like the patches on the ground on the bigger maps, it's not as big of a deal. But some of the maps that are very corridor based can force you into standing on icy ground constantly throughout the entire map, which just feels really bad. The other change is that they're looking to remove towers and then do the Path of Exile 1 strategy, where you can juice a map directly when you open it. Part of me feels a little sad because they're kind of just reverting to what Path of Exile 1 does, a solution that they know is going to work. But I think they're kind of just admitting that the towers, as in the current iteration, just does not, God, that's blinding, just do not really work the way they're supposed to. And oftentimes it requires you to do a large amount of traversal on the Atlas, which in a lot of cases can feel really bad. Like if you have a really nice juiced location on the Atlas that has 5 or 6 things on it, as Elon would say. So you'd have to like kind of, juice it up and do it. But if you fail, sometimes you have to do like 2 to 10 amounts of traversing, just doing, non-juiced maps to go around the map and find towers. If you can't find 2 or 3 towers in one area, it's hard to get the really high level monsters that you're looking for hyper endgame. And all this can get really weird. So glad they're making adjustments to that, but I kind of want to see how it's going to feel to do the PoE 1 direct juicing rather than the towers, and see how that compares in PoE 2 before I give an updated feel on where the end game is right now. I like the Ubers and the different bosses you can face. I do like kind of the experiences you get as part of the Atlas, like having to discover things and random things happening and locations and stuff like that can make a really cool experience for you in the end game. But I do want to experience those new changes before I give an updated thought on where the end game is at now. So I'm going to leave the video there. It's already super long. It was just kind of like a brain dump on where Path of Exile 2 is right now in .3 and early access. Let me know where your head is at. I'd be curious to hear what your opinions are on where Path of Exile is now and where it's going in the future. And if you had the opportunity to go to New Zealand and put up on their whiteboard things that you would like to see addressed sooner rather than later, what would be your list? Drop that down below in the comments. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.